All right, let's start here. We'll see. Every day I'm convinced I'm going to lose my voice by the end of the day, so we'll see if my voice, which is sounding a little raspy, holds out for this entire class. Okay, and my next one. All right, so we ended off last time. We're talking about unions. We're almost done with our course content, obviously, because the course is almost at an end. I guess I'm not sure if there's any things I need to talk about in terms of announcements. I'll talk next class just about the final exam, dates and formats and all of that stuff. But it'll be, very similar to exactly like the other two. And then, if you're wanting to come in and see your midterm, do use the appointment booking link on Canvas and book an appointment sooner rather than later. Already I don't have a ton of slots left for this week and next, so do jump in and book a time as soon as you can if you're wanting to come in. Okay, so we were talking about kind of the history of unions last time. We talked sort of, their medieval roots. They start with these kind of craft guilds, and we get into the Industrial Revolution, and workers want to organize and get more concessions from their employers. And you start to get these cycles where they try to, organize, get together. They still don't have collective rights. And in a lot of cases, governments are very much aligned with employers, right? The employers and the people who govern are often from the same social classes. So they're able to get some concessions, right? Things like 9-hour work days. But labor legislations remained really weak into the beginning of the 20th century. And you have some kind of aborted attempts to create union type groups, trade and labor congress being an example of that. And we get eventually to, the beginning part of the 20th century and probably one of the periods of greatest labor strife. As workers get more skilled, as they get more educated, they start to want to demand things like, a living wage and the ability to support themselves, which is not being given by their employers. So you get things like the Winnipeg General Strike. Now, this was not particularly uncommon, right, during this kind of early 20th century period. Workers were increasingly kind of getting together, despite the fact that they often sort of lacked the legal right to do so. And this, right, if I go back here, the Winnipeg General Strike was one of 400 strikes in Canada in the year 1919. So it is a 6-week strike, that lasted from May until July 1919, and involved, at its height, about 30,000 workers in the city of Winnipeg. And they basically shut down whole industries at the time, right? So banks, the kind of public transit, streetcars, the mail, telegrams, telephones, food delivery, water, the power supply, police, and fire services all went on strike. So it was a period of enormous disruption for the city of Winnipeg. And the typical things they were demanding were things like the right to collectively bargain, because unions at that point were illegal, right? Unions were actually, you could form unions, but collective bargaining was illegal, right? Basically, they were not allowed to form unions for the purpose of collective bargaining. The state had passed laws to that effect. So they wanted things like a living wage, right? Enough money to be able to support yourself, and an 8-hour workday, right? Down from a 9-hour workday, which was the standard at that point. And other things like they wanted scheduled breaks and all sorts of stuff like that. What was the midterm average? I think it was just a hair below 81%, if I recall. I believe so, yeah. It's like 40.49 or something. So yeah, just a hair below 81%. A little higher than the first one. Okay. So our second wave of unions, right? This is our industrial unionization. So coming out of things like, out of those big strikes of the 1910s and 1920s, things start to change. The other thing that happens is, how should we put it? Obviously in the wake of the Second World War, you get the formation of, the Communist Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? Or the Soviet Union, as it's more colloquially referred to. As a kind of communist country, right? And the first communist country anywhere in the world, the formation of the USSR, as ostensibly like a workers' paradise, puts the fear of kind of communist revolutions in the kind of front of mind for people. And it changes the sort of general framework that you see in the West, right? In the kind of capitalist countries. Because if we don't do something, we too might end up with, a workers' revolution, at home. So the formation of the Soviet Union really forces kind of, employers and governments in other countries to change their approach to workers. And so by the 1930s, you get changes in labor laws, right? Changes in the way they're treated, and you get organized kind of unions in a lot of really core kind of primary industries, right? So you see unions forming in logging, mining, steel production, electrical production, like power generation, automotives, and in like clothing and other cloth manufacturing, textiles, right? So they changed the laws to allow collective bargaining in these sorts of industries. Workers do get together, form these great big unions, and in the post-World War II period, again, in part driven by kind of fears of communism and communism's spread, there's really strong support for labor unions, really at the state level, right, for allowing them to exist. And they become very, very powerful. And not for nothing, right, in this period, you have the lowest level of economic inequality of any kind of period we've had ever, right? This is pretty much as good as it gets in the West. Workers are making good wages, they've got good benefits, their salaries are growing year on year, they can afford more, they can go buy nice houses. And this is why, a lot of times this kind of period, especially the post-war period, has this sort of like hazy utopian kind of air to it, right? Because it was a really good time for workers, right? You could afford to live on the salary of one adult in a household working in the factory, right? So you could have, kind of the stay-at-home parent, usually stay-at-home mom in this period, where dad went to work at the factory and came home at night, and that was enough to support a whole family and have not just support them, but have a really, really good life. Okay, Mid to late 1940s, especially like the 45 to 49, you get increasing legislation in Canada on collective bargaining, right, which regularizes it, makes it more standardized, basically lays out how collective bargaining happens, and labor practices, for the private sector, or legislation that kind of legislates labor practices in the private sector and sets up an industrial relations framework, right? So what does a collective bargaining process look like? How does it go? You go negotiations, you go, mediation, and then you go to, something like binding mediation or strike or lockout. Okay. And then the mid 1950s, again, probably one of the kind of halcyon days for the union movement. You get the formation of all sorts of things like the Canadian Labour Congress that brings a bunch of unions together to kind of set the rules for unions. As unions become more powerful, it becomes necessary to figure out how you're going to govern it. And one of the things that really, they need to figure out, the economic and political interests of the affiliated unions, right? So how are they going to, what candidates are they going to support? How are they going to get involved in politics? And then things like it sets boundaries, right? So jurisdictional conflicts. One of the things that happens is unions, the bigger the union, the more powerful it is. So everybody wants more members, but what the union movement doesn't want is one union raiding other unions for members, right? Being like, if you come, we're the Canadian Auto Workers and you guys work in a mine, but if you come join, the Canadian Auto Workers, we'll give you these benefits, right? So it sets up, kind of rules around how you're able to recruit members, how unions can join together, and these sorts of things. So it gets rid of raiding, where unions would basically try to raid other industries to increase their numbers to give themselves more power. Okay. Now our last wave of unionization, the third wave, and this would be like 1960 to present, is the unionization of the public sector, right? So these are things like, nurses, teachers, government workers, right? So you could think of like, in Canada, you've got like CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. I guess in Alberta, you have AUP, the Alberta Union of Public Employees. And then you have things like the ATA. I think it's United Nurses of Alberta I can't remember which association, but I think it's United Nurses of Alberta that represents the nurses, right? Basically, a lot of workers that work for the public sector, whether in like skilled professions like, teaching and nursing, or just as kind of general government bureaucrats, join, start to collectively set up and collectively bargain, right? So that they too, get sort of workers' rights. Okay. So formerly, these were associations, not unions, and you still get, some of this language. The Alberta Teachers Association, for example, is still called an association, even though it does collectively bargain on behalf of all the teachers. There's some, there's some kind of fuzziness, because what ends up happening with a lot of these is they're professional associations. So they do two things at the same time. They do maybe three things at the same time. So they mediate fights between, say, the employer and members, right? So if, say, a teacher is having trouble with their administrator, right, with the principal, they mediate those fights. They also collectively bargain, but they also set standards for who can belong to a profession, and what kind of, educational standards, professional standards are set. So they do a whole bunch of things at the same time. Initially, they did not bargain for working conditions, but as you get into the 1960s, right, they see all of the kind of gains that have been made in the industrial unions, and they want some of those gains as well, right? They want better, teachers who go, and typically get, in the 1960s, you're probably talking about 3 years of education in a kind of teacher's college, want, the same kind of benefits that industrial workers are getting. So, they start to get together and demand these collective rights, and the right to strike, at least to some extent, right? Given that some of these are are considered core industries, right, like nursing, and things that are sort of a state requirement, right, essential service, not everybody always gets the right to strike. But they get together and they start to demand the right to do these same things that are, happening in private sector unions. Now, there's always a little bit of concern with public sector unions, right? Because they work for the state. They use a lot of their union dues, right? The money they collect from members to advocate for specific policies. And so it's, and how to put this? It's like if you could collect money from your members, use that money to help political candidates get office, and then negotiate with those same people that you just helped get elected for more benefits for your constituency, right? Public sector unions always have this sort of slightly incestuous relationship with the government, because you are essentially bargaining with the people that you often help get elected. So there's a lot of fear that public sector unions will favor the parties that are going to give them the most kind of benefits, and then collect money from that very same state, right? It's like if you were in a public sector union and you could use the money you collected to elect people to the board of directors of a company, and only then use it to elect people that are going to give you the most benefits, right? That probably wouldn't be good for the business, right? Because eventually worker compensation would chew more and more into everything. And the same kind of argument goes for public sector unions, but they have become a really large part of the union movement today. Okay, so the public sector unions, are very successful. And in Canada today, it's something like about 40% of public sector workers are fully unionized. So that's quite large. And in a lot of cases, the growth of these public sector unions offsets the kind of slow decline that starts in the 1970s of the private sector unions, right? Private sector unions will contract tremendously in the coming decades, but public sector unions continue to grow and grow. Okay. So, what role does the state play in kind of union or worker disputes? At least the way the legislation is typically framed, it says that the state is supposed to be an unbiased umpire. Now, obviously, or an impartial umpire, right? This is obviously somewhat problematic, especially as the public sector unions come to be really large and powerful, and they spend money to help elect particular political candidates. But, it is definitely the way the legislation is conceived. Okay, so the first kind of big legislation on this was under, William Lyon Mackenzie King's government, what's called the Industrial Disputes Investigation Act. And basically, it set up the kind of institutionalized conflict conciliation and arbitration system, right? So basically, if you're having a dispute with your employer, right, you go on strike, or you want to go on strike, you want to negotiate a new collective agreement, it sets up the rules for how this works. And very specifically, it banned strikes or lockouts during the term of a collective agreement. So you cannot strike legally if you are, so even let's say you sign an agreement, right? Your union signed an agreement and you're no longer happy with it, right? This happens, say, with the teachers. The teachers had signed this great big long 10-year contract with the government. And by the end of it, like the last 2 years, they were really unhappy with it, right? Because cost of living had spiked tremendously in that 10-year period, and their wages had not grown in a concomitant fashion. But under kind of legislation that we have, they're bound by that collective agreement. So they cannot strike, and the school boards couldn't lock them out. If they were to strike, their unions would be fined basically into oblivion, right? Okay. Collective bargaining is made a right in the private sector in 1944, right? Officially, right? Anyone in a private sector job after 1944 could form a union and collectively bargain. Okay. And the IDIA enshrines what's called the RAND formula. So RAND is a a judge that basically passes a ruling on this particular piece of legislation, and it says, that even though you're not required to join a union in a union workplace, so in a workplace where people have voted to create a union, if you join that workplace, even if you don't want to personally join the union, it is legal for them to automatically deduct union dues from your paycheck, right? Now, this is a formula that basically is made to make unions more powerful, right? Because it would be relatively easy over time for employers to pick off particular members, right? Or only hire, say, new people that weren't going to join the union. So you could sort of whittle away a union basically by eventually reducing the amount of union dues that they were collecting. If you could say, well, you can only collect union dues from people who want to join the union. And then, you hire younger workers, and younger workers typically want to keep more of their paycheck, right? Not pay union dues. Trust me, I look at my paycheck every now and then. And while I value the work that the academic staff union does, sometimes I'm like, man, that is a big chunk of money off my paycheck every year, which I wouldn't mind having back in my pocket, but, we value what they do anyway. You could sort of pick off and weaken unions if you change this legislation or change this kind of formula where, individual members wouldn't have to pay if they didn't want to join the union. So the RAND formula enshrines that, okay, if you work in a union shop, everybody is paying union dues, whether you want to be a member of the union or not. So broadly, everybody joins unions, right? And that keeps unions really strong, and it weakens the ability of employers to weaken unions through hiring younger workers or kind of making side deals to hire people who don't want to join the union. Okay. All right, union membership in Canada has been dropped. It starts pretty low, in the 1910s, kind of peaks out, around the 1980s, and then kind of drops significantly after that. Private sector, this is all unions, so this includes public sector workers. Private sector unionization in Canada now stands at somewhere around, bless you, 5.4%. So it's really pretty low. Only about 5.4% of workers in Canada belong to a private sector union. It's about 30% of workers overall, but that is mostly down to the huge number of public sector workers we have in the country. In Canada, about 1 in 4 people work in a public sector job, myself included. So, okay. All right, we have, owing to the fact that public sector unions have essentially taken over in Canada, we basically have a huge shift. Today, there are more female or more women who are members of unions than men, right? As our industrial unions have declined and our public sector unions have gotten bigger, the share of kind of men to women has really flipped, right? Used to be many more men when the union movement was dominated in industrial sectors. Now that it's public sector, it's many more women than men who are in unions. Young workers, right, super underrepresented, and the way that especially industries that employ young people often work really means that there's very little option to join a union in most of them. And one way, I don't know if I have this anymore. I took it out at one point. Franchising is a great way of getting around unions. Because a union would essentially, because let's say you own a McDonald's, right? Your franchise is not part of McDonald's. It is a franchise of McDonald's owned by you. And therefore, if a union wants to form, they have to go to each McDonald's and get a vote of the majority of people working there to unionize, right? Which has made it really difficult to unionize anything that's franchised, right? So franchising has been a great way of getting around unions in general. Okay, so, yeah, different rates our highest level of unionization is in education and public administration, right? So not surprisingly, public sector unions have the highest rate of unionization. I think in education in Canada, it's nearly 100% because only like charter schools and private schools don't have unions attached to them. So it's a very small number of people in that industry that aren't unionized. And yeah, there are some, provincial differences in labor legislation. Obviously Ontario and Quebec tend to have much stronger labor laws, and places like Alberta have much weaker ones where, Alberta has been less friendly to unionization in general. And at this point, it's really only really big workplaces that are unionized, right? Typically, really large companies in primary sectors of the economy. Okay. So, the largest unions in Canada today, come from this 1967 piece of legislation, the Public Service Staff Relations Act, which basically allowed for the creation of public sector unions. The largest one in Canada is CUPE, right? And it's wide ranging and it's across Canada, right? And you have provincial public employees, federal public employees that are all members of CUPE. So it is a massive union. The largest industrial union is Unifor, right? Which basically is a merged union that includes the formerly the Canadian Auto Workers, and the Communication, Energy, and Paper Workers Union, or CEP, that merged together in the 1990s to form Unifor. And Unifor, kind of grows and grows as well. It's as unionization fails in some industries, it kind of goes along and picks up different members in different places. And it's done things like try to pick up, janitorial unions and these sorts of things in different industries, just trying to get, again, as large as possible. Okay, what am I doing for? I think I have 28 slides, so I'm pretty good here. Okay, when we talk about US unions, you can see the kind of decline. Again, the 1980s is kind of a high point in the US for private sector unionization. About 20% of workers in 1983 were in the private sector. That had declined to 11.4% in 2010, and by 2024, it's now about 5.9% of workers in the US economy are in private sector unions. So the private sector union movement is quite small in the US. And I mean, always the biggest one was United Auto Workers. As the US auto industry, right, and especially the big three American automakers, Ford, General Motors, and what used to be Chrysler, then was Fiat Chrysler, and I guess it was Daimler Chrysler, then Fiat Chrysler, and now it's Stellantis. As all of these companies have declined, basically the union movement has really suffered in the US. Okay. There have been really strong anti-union campaigns. One of the chief architects of this, especially in the 1980s, was Ronald Reagan. Reagan went after a whole bunch of unions, particularly the Air Traffic Controllers Union. He's really famous for this. Air traffic controllers in the US were unionized. And basically when Reagan came in, they were threatening to go on strike. And instead of dealing with it, he fired them all and rehired anyone who wanted to continue working, basically breaking the back of the Air Traffic Controllers Union. And this is seen as a kind of watershed moment in the union battles in the US, because it signaled a moment where the US federal government, especially under Republicans, was not only going to be unwilling to protect the union movement, but was openly hostile to it. And what you've seen is this has just continued, right? The US federal government, especially under Republicans at both the state and federal level, have generally been anti-union. Not for nothing. The unions have tended to back the Democrats overwhelmingly, and therefore it's created this hostility between labor and government in lots of ways, or Republican government in lots of ways. You've also had, obviously, management innovations, especially automation, right, which has cut down the number of workers in a lot of industries. Downsizing, offshoring, and like privatization of government services in lots of places, which has cut into public sector unions in the US, and things like the right to work laws. And you find this especially in the South. And right to work laws are basically sort of the opposite of, that RAND formula we talked about. In a lot of US southern states, these right to work laws say, even if you go into a union or unionized workplace, you don't have to join the union and you don't have to pay union dues. And what this has done is gut unions, right? Basically, new people coming in typically don't want to join the union because that's extra fees off your paycheck. And basically that's made it harder to keep union members. Now, some industries have seen increasing unionization. Las Vegas, weirdly enough, is one of these places that has a very active labor movement. And so anyone who works in a casino, basically like the janitors, the dealers, and all these people are all part of these big labor movements. And weirdly, I believe at this point, they joined the United Auto Workers. So they're part of the, same union as the workers on the Ford factory floor in Detroit. They all kind of you've had this kind of consolidation as different people kind of get together, different groups, try to get into these big unions to try and preserve any kind of labor rights that they have. And it's been very successful in places like Las Vegas, like in Nevada in general. Okay. So, how does this collective action work? Albert Hirschman basically says that when workers, have some kind of dissatisfaction with their employment, they essentially have two choices. They can either leave, right, which is what he calls exit, or voice their concerns, right, which is organize, basically push for changes, push for changes, usually through organized labor. And what Hirschman says is actually unions tend to increase the chance that workers will stay and actually, voice their concerns rather than just get fed up with whatever problem is there and leave. And this ultimately is, Hirschman thinks is good for employers because turnover means more training, means, typically more quality control issues and all of these things. Now, that said, unions tend to suffer from what is referred to as a free rider problem. And now this is true essentially of any organized group, right? You can look at, religious groups. Religious groups tend to have free rider problems as well. Any kind of organized group that generates benefits for its members is potentially going to run into free rider problems. And unions have huge free rider problems. Basically, all the members have access to the organization's achievements, right? So if you're part of a union, you're going to get better wages, better benefits, and all of that, whether you do something or not, right? Whether you work on it, when it comes time to strike, maybe you don't show up on the picket lines, right? You just stay home, and watch Netflix. But if that union manages to bargain for some benefits, you will still get access to those benefits just by being there, even though you didn't do anything for it. And generally speaking, the percentage of union members that actually work to do things for the union is relatively low. It's, somewhere 5% or lower. Okay, I had a short Simpsons video. This is not specifically related to unions, but it kind of shows the free rider problem because Homer here is being a free rider. That is playing on the speakers on my laptop. I don't know if it's worth me actually fixing this. It's a very short clip. Okay, try that.
What do you mean by suggested donation?
Pay any amount you wish, sir.
And what if I wish to pay...
Okay, we hear nothing. Okay, forget it. I'll explain the clip very briefly. Homer goes to the Natural History Museum with Lisa, and it's like a suggested donation, And he's like, what if I just $5, but you can give whatever you like? And he's like, what if I give nothing? And she's like, that's your choice. And he goes in and enjoys the museum, right? Which he's being a free rider, right? He's not contributing anything to this kind of process. I don't know why that didn't work. Okay. So, how do you form a union? Right? Basically, to form a union in any industry, you need to basically get 50% plus one, right, members of that workplace to vote to join the union. So precisely one more than half the people in the workplace, right? So a majority, even if it's a bare majority, right, they need to sign union cards, right, or their pledge that they want to join a union. Now, this is often done, right, when you get a union drive, and a particular industry wants to unionize, the big unions will come in and help, right? So in Canada, right, so in the US, UAW is the biggest. In Canada, it's Unifor. And in cases where industries have wanted to unionize, often those big unions come in and offer their resources to try and help those groups, get unionized. Again, often with the hope that they will join. And this is what happened, right, in the push to unionize casinos in Nevada, right? The UAW, even though it's an auto workers union, came in, helped organize workers, helped campaign with workers to sign those union cards. And when they got those 50% of casino workers to sign the union cards, they joined the UAW, right? And the UAW started to represent them. Okay. What we typically see, though, is you're more likely to be able to form a union in particular conditions, right? So things like shared identity and solidarity are really important. So places where people who work together for a long time are more likely to form unions. This is why, places like, despite lots of efforts, places like McDonald's, Walmart, any kind of big retailer, there's been lots of pushes where people want to organize, even Amazon, right? Amazon workers, where people have wanted to form unions in these places. But it's really difficult because you have transient workforces, right? People come in, they leave. There's a lot of churn in those workplaces. So there's no kind of shared identity in those workplaces. People who come from similar kind of social backgrounds, like they're all working class, they all come from kind of similar, ethnic, religious backgrounds. You see this with coal miners or auto workers, right? They all kind of came from similar backgrounds, ethnically, religiously, and culturally, and where work is a big part of their life and identity, right? Miners in particular, right, for a long time, it was a lifestyle, right? It was not just part of, something that had maybe been in their family for generations. Everybody had gone into logging, everybody had gone into, mining or whatever, right? So in those kinds of conditions, you tend to have a greater chance of forming a union. As our society's gotten more pluralistic, more transient, unions are harder to form, right? Because people share less of these qualities. And yeah, you typically need kind of strong leadership that's organic, right? Outsiders coming in and telling you that you should unionize doesn't typically work. When it's people from inside an organization that has these kinds of qualities, right? They often feel like that person, the person organizing the union, is one of us. So you need to be part of the group, typically. Outsiders are not going to convince you because people often view them as having a outside agenda. Okay. Other things that tend to work towards, unionization, supportive communities, right? Again, with that kind of cultural and social cohesion, often the people around those workers are going to be very supportive. Once you get urbanization, right, and people live more in cities, they're more atomized, it gets much harder to form these kinds of communities and therefore much harder to unionize. You still see this often, I guess, with like teachers and nurses because people tend to like teachers and nurses, right? Because the teachers, teach their kids, nurses take care of people in the hospital. And so broad communities can be quite supportive of them. A hostile employer, right? If the employer seems reasonable and amenable, it's less likely at the end of the day that a union's going to form and that you're going to be able to coalesce support. But if if an employer is outright hostile to workers, that is going to help generally. And obviously, favorable labor legislation. Places with stronger labor laws have more unions, like the U.S., like the Rust Belt, right? Michigan, Ohio, and such. But if you look at the U.S. South, it's really hard to form a union. Okay, and all of those things, make unions more likely. All right, I think I got 2 more slides here. So, you have 2 things that tend to have 2 kinds of labor action that we can talk about. One is obviously a strike, right? And this is where workers collectively try to force concessions out of an employer by withdrawing their labor, right? They say, we're not going to work until we get these concessions. And there's a few different kinds, right? Wildcat strikes. A wildcat strike is an illegal strike. So you have just a strike, right? That's a kind of a general strike. But you have other forms, right? A wildcat strike is an illegal strike. It is a strike during the term of a collective agreement. So if you go on strike while you have a collective agreement signed, that is called a wildcat strike. It is illegal. It doesn't happen very often, but it happens sometimes. You'll sometimes get rotating strikes. For a while, educational assistants in like the public school system in Edmonton, were doing these rotating strikes. Specifically, some of them would go into work and some of them wouldn't, right? And that is, you don't want to shut down maybe your employer entirely, but you want to kind of cause a little bit of pain. So some workers go in, some don't. You see this actually, a little bit with police. When police are collectively bargaining, they'll sometimes do something called what's a rotating strike. It's sometimes called a blue flu. Basically, because police can't legally go on strike, a whole bunch of them will, the union will organize, and a whole bunch of them will call in sick, right? And basically, they can't, too sick, can't come in, and they basically set it up so that they have just enough police officers to basically keep the police force running, right, to man kind of basic operations, but not any more than that. And this is a form of a rotating strike, right? It's like we're going to bring in we're going to put a little bit of pressure just to, make our point without shutting down the employer or technically violating any laws. And then a sympathy strike, again, these don't happen very often anymore, but this is where a union would strike in solidarity with another union, right? So let's say, I don't know, I'll put it this way, right? We have 2 big unions at the U of A. One is OSHWA, the Academic Staff Union, and one is NASA, the Non-Academic Staff Association. And what's happened in the past is at universities, when one goes on strike, the other one will go on strike at the same time, basically in solidarity, whether they're at the same place in bargaining or not, to kind of put extra pressure on the employer. Okay, so those are your strikes. A lockout, an employer refuses to let workers come to work, right? Basically, they shut down the workplace, trying to force the workers to give them concessions. And usually this is things like wage clawbacks, right? Or benefits clawbacks, reducing pensions or something like that. I mean, I think we've most famously seen this in sports, right? The industry we all have the most sympathy for, I'm sure. The NHL, in the last 30 years, has I think had 3 separate lockouts where basically the owners say, we're shutting down, professional hockey until we get these concessions from the players' union. Okay, I really want this one to work because this one's funny. Okay, that one will work. Okay, so you can have two kinds of, I had blue flu here. You can have two kinds of labor actions: organized, right? One that is, basically set up by the union, and this can take, the form of a strike, a slowdown, or a blue flu. So I talked about a blue flu, I talked about a strike. This is what a slowdown looks like.
Pull a file for me.
Sorry, I need another 5 hours to put this box of needles away.
I don't get it.
It's a slowdown, Ted. The nurses think they're being clever. Still treating patients, but with everything else moving more slowly. And why are you standing here doing nothing?
I know this is a slowdown, but I can't really work any slower than I normally do, so I pretty much have to come to a complete stop. Now, if you're asking why I'm standing here specifically, it's because I replaced that light bulb with a tanning bulb. I'm tired of being the only white guy at my mosque.
You know what? If the nurses keep going on like this, I'm going to give them their raise. But I'm going to pay for it by firing 3 of them, the ugly ones.
Okay, so a slowdown, right? Rather than stopping work altogether, during an agreement or in a regulated industry like nursing, you just do things as slowly as possible to basically keep basic operations going, but just grind it right down to a stop. Okay, and then our unorganized kind of labor action would be something like a spontaneous walkout, right, where people just get sick of things and walk off the job, usually because there's some kind of workplace conditions that are too intolerable for them. And then I talked about a wildcat strike a second ago. All right, so that's it for unions. Okay, we'll just call it a day with 4 minutes left. No point in starting something new. Got 3 lectures left, Friday, Monday, and Wednesday. So I'll try to get through, stress and job satisfaction Friday, Monday, and do review on Wednesday. We'll keep going from there. But yeah, we will. I'm going to shut her down for today and